I was strongly supportive of increasing home ownership, especially amongst minorities, which indeed is where the whole ownership boom occurred. The reason basically is that in a market economy which is based on property rights, it is very critical to have as broad a swath of people who have a vested interest in that system to make it work. So I was very much supportive of expanding home ownership as best we could.
You have said things, though. April 8th in 2005, I think you gave a speech at the Federal Reserve System's Community Affairs Research Conference, and I'm going to read here, where once more marginal applicants would simply have been denied credit, lenders are now able to quite efficiently judge the risk posed by individual applicants and to price that risk appropriately. That was April 2005.
That statement is true. The vast majority of those types of loans were doing perfectly fine. In my view, that discrimination was going on in a significant manner, was very evident from the statistics, and from the point of view of a banker, I'm saying they were leaving money on the table, and that indeed it was highly desirable to expand mortgages for what effectively became what was not then described as the subprime market. What happened, unfortunately, as I went on, was that the advent of securitization took this little niche product, which I thought was doing rather quite well, and by the end of 2005 began to securitize it at a very rapid pace. Securitization got up to 80% of subprimes late in 2005. Several years earlier, it was at 50%.
Yeah.
And if it were not for the securitization, and not for essentially spreading those mortgage backs across the world, the subprime problem would have been constrained to the United States, because I know of no single mortgage that is subprime which is held outside the United States other than in securitized form.
You're essentially saying there's nothing the Fed could have done.
To prevent the bubble?
Correct.
Yes, we could have. We could have basically clamped down on the American economy, generated a 10% unemployment rate, and I will guarantee we would not have had a housing boom, a stock market boom, or indeed a particularly good economy either. Remember that a necessary condition for these types of booms is a sense of general underlying confidence or euphoria. Low interest rates, low long-term interest rates, and essentially a availability of credit coming essentially from the securitization, not from the securitization, but from the intermediation of these huge capital gains on stocks and other assets on a worldwide basis. Could central banks have prevented it? Yes. Could they do it with short-term interest rates only? I doubt it. In other words, you have to break down the expectation of the long-term flow of income from assets to bring asset prices down. And I don't think there was any individual central bank in the world who had the political support to do what would have been required. In other words, had we attempted to really put the clamp on, which is dubious as to whether it would work in any event, I could assure you the whole question of Federal Reserve independence would have surfaced.
Right.
It's Federal Reserve
palatable to the electorate at large.
Federal Reserve independence is not carved in stone.
At the end of the day, we were having enormous inflation in asset prices, namely in homes, and
that's accurate, but that's
the Fed should have acted on that.
But the question is, let's go back and say, what could we have done to prevent it? First of all,
well, you said you could have. You could have left the economy, is what you essentially said.
It is a worldwide phenomenon that basically it's going on everywhere, and when you see that, you look for a common cause, and the common cause was the decline in real global long-term interest rates. Now, was there something the Fed could have done? Even in retrospect, I say nothing that I could have seen short of undermining the flow of profits which was supporting the stock market, or the flow of revenues that is supporting the housing market.
Frankly, when you would have had to have done it, you said you weren't aware that subprime certainly would become the problem it ultimately proved to be.
That's true, but even were we aware at the time, it's not terribly clear what we could do, basically because the central bank, starting probably in 2002, had lost control over interest rates with maturities in excess of 5 years. And remember, unless and until we could control the mortgage rate, which would have suppressed it, there was nothing fundamentally that could have been done that would have been effective.
This bubble was going to happen regardless.
Well, the question is, you've got the following problem. You've got long-term interest rates falling. You've got mortgage rates falling around the world. You've got expansion in prices moving up virtually everywhere, and indeed, the rise in prices in the United States was not above the average. There were many other countries with far higher rates of expansion than we. And so what we're dealing with is essentially a global issue over which central banks had, by the year 2002, lost virtually all control. Remember, the conundrum that I was concerned about in 2004, we had, every time we raised rates in the post-World War II period, the long-term rate would move with us, the mortgage rates would move with us, and that's the reason why everyone's analysis based on history argued that the short-term rate was a key factor in the housing price and the housing boom. The truth of the matter is it was the tie between short-term rates and long-term rates which existed in the post-World War II period, but it was the long-term rates which created these price patterns in all sorts of assets. But that tie was broken, and it's now clearly broken, which meant that the ability of any central bank, and I don't want to go to speak for the Bank of England or for the ECB or others, but I know they're all experiencing very much the same patterns that we saw. So that it may very well have been interesting to try to constrain credit in the United States, and we could have. But in order to do it enough to break the back of what was a global phenomenon, I hesitate to think of how much contraction we would have to induce in the American economy to get that, and in the end would have turned out to probably been worse off than we are even now.